Pentecostalism is one of the largest and fastest growing traditions within Christianity, and a number of people actually consider Charles F. Parham one of the founders of this movement. For this episode of Theology Breakdown, we're going to look at his life, his theology, and some of his controversies. For this interview, I actually had the privilege of interviewing Dr. James R. Goff Jr., who wrote this really helpful book to better understand Charles Parham. Hey, my name is Josh Samuel, and I'm the host of Theology Breakdown, where we really seek to break down the transforming themes of theology in an accessible format. Check out the episode. Okay, so I'm really excited to have Dr. James Goff join us here, who is the author of Fields White Unto Harvest, Charles F. Parham, and the Missionary Origins of Pentecostalism. Thank you so much, Dr. Goff, for joining me here on Theology Breakdown.
It's good to be here, Josh. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again. You know, I met you at SPS, Society of Pentecostal Studies, many years ago in Memphis. And I just remember your wife and yourself were just very hospitable. I was just a PhD student at the time, came with my wife. And I remember reading your book, Fields White Unto Harvest, as a really important source when I was doing my PhD work studying Pentecostal history and theology. So I was like, whoa, there's James R. Goff. You know, I'm a lucky guy. And so, and you were really kind, and I appreciated your humility and your wife as well. And so I'm really excited to dive into this topic. I'll be honest with you. So I actually did a video on William Seymour for Theology Breakdown a while back. And I thought to myself, I'd really like to do something on Charles F. Parham. And I thought to myself, who would be awesome if I could ever get is James R. Goff Jr. If I could get James R. Goff Jr. on the show to talk about Charles F. Parham because of his incredible influence on Pentecostalism, I was like, oh, that'd be amazing. So it's like, well, why don't I reach out? The worst he can say is no. And you were just so kind to join me today, and really thankful for that. Your book, Fields White Unto Harvest, extremely helpful book. I know it's helped a lot of scholars and people who are just interested in the Pentecostal movement. I'm curious to know why you did so much research and writing on Charles Parham. Like, what about it that drew you to work on this?
Well, thank you, Josh. I appreciate your kind comments. There are a lot of things. I mean, I've been where you were as a PhD student and where you are as a younger professor. I mean, and I think in history, maybe in most fields, but certainly in history, a lot of what we end up researching has something to do with us personally. So, I mean, I grew up in a Pentecostal holiness church, very, self-conscious of the fact that my church was a little different. We were a little louder, and not quite as socially prominent, those kinds of things. So, became a Christian at the age of 11, sanctified and filled with the Spirit at the age of 13. Very fortunate to be in a church with a large youth choir, musically strong.
If you don't mind me asking, what do you mean by sanctified and filled with the Holy Spirit?
Well, those are Pentecostal holiness, out of the holiness movement, the concept of sanctification. And for those of us in the Wesleyan tradition, there's a second definite work of grace. Whereas for those in the Reformed tradition, the Keswickian tradition in Pentecostalism, more of a growth in grace. And I think for me, it was a combination of both. There's a point at which you claim sanctification, recognize it, and then you continue to grow, hopefully, throughout your life. So, but it's the lingo of a person from a Pentecostal holiness background or a Church of God, probably Church of God in Christ, as compared to maybe an Assemblies of God, where they just talked about being saved and filled with the Spirit. So it's the language, the semantics of the whole thing. I think all Pentecostals that I know, I believe in sanctification, but they explain it a little bit differently. Finished work of grace. You remember that from William Durham, who influenced the Assemblies of God. So that's what sanctification.
Okay. All right. So, and I interjected. Go on. Okay. You're kind of telling me why you went.
Yeah. I mean, so that was my background, and my original career goals, believe it or not, was to be a chaplain. I mean, I felt called to preach, and did preach some when I was a young man. Went to Emmanuel College in Franklin Springs, Georgia, which is Pentecostal Holiness College. But when I finished the 2-year program there, I consciously wanted to go to a good undergraduate institution to finish my BA, because I wanted to go to seminary and go in the military as a chaplain. So I went to Wake Forest, worked out. That's where I met Connie. And then I went to Duke and did the MDiv program there. Along the way, I should say, God was very gracious to me. I became had as a teacher and became a very good friend of Vincent Simon. His last year at Emmanuel, which was my freshman year. And then when I went to Duke, a young, actually University of North Carolina professor named Grant Wacker was cross-teaching some at Duke, because the regular American Christianity professor was on leave. So I got to meet Grant, who's been a lifelong friend and mentor in the study of Pentecostalism. But it was while I was at Duke, preparing for what I thought would be a career in the Navy as a chaplain, that I got interested in church history. And when I graduated, there were no spots open for the Pentecostal Holiness Church in the Navy. And it was Grant, more than anyone else, who said, you really ought to think about grad school. And he recommended some programs. And so I thought, well, while I'm waiting, I will continue this pursuit of American church history. I had begun to study Pentecostalism way back at Emmanuel under Vincent Simon, and continued that with Grant at Duke. So I ended up going to the University of Arkansas, where the third mentor of a fellow who just passed away this past year, David Edwin Harrell, who wrote a book on the healing evangelist in the 1950s, wonderful Christian man from the Churches of Christ tradition, became my mentor at the University of Arkansas. He was writing his biography of Oral Roberts at the time. And so that's how I get to Parham. I was a young PhD student with a focus on American religious history. Knew I wanted to study Pentecostalism because of the early work I'd done as an undergrad and then at Duke. And believe it or not, the project that I'm working on now, Josh, on Elvis Presley and his background in Pentecostalism and his love of gospel music, because I did a book on gospel music on the quartet tradition. And I remember my first year at Arkansas, I sat down with Ed. We did a study, or he wanted me to do sort of an independent study with him. And I began to study Pentecostalism, and I learned about Parham. I first learned about Parham, as my freshman year at Emmanuel, working with Vincent. And I remember mentioning to Ed in his office, I'd really like to do something on Elvis Presley. He grew up in the Assemblies of God tradition. Elvis had been dead about 5 years at that point. It was 1982. And my wife and I had actually, we had kind of met and essentially fallen in love, in part because of Elvis, because she had been to one of his last concerts, his concert in April of '77 in Greensboro. Wow. And so when I met her through the Fellowship of Christian Athletes at Wake Forest, I found out she'd been to that concert. He had just passed away. He died in August, and we met in September of '77. And I found out she'd been to that concert, and I was just, fascinated. And so we got to talking. And so anyway, when we went to Arkansas, we visited Graceland for the first time. And it's hard for people to understand what I'm about to say, but Graceland had just opened to the public. And I remember we pulled into a gravel parking lot across the street. If you go there now, it looks like an airport terminal. It's a huge, big business. It was a gravel parking lot, got in a little van. They took us across the street. There were literally potholes in the driveway. It had been left pretty much alone for 5 years. And Elvis didn't really have a whole lot of money when he died. Oh. He was somewhat of a spendthrift, and money hadn't really been managed that well. His former wife, Priscilla, took care of that. Very smart businesswoman. And so they were just opening it up to the public. And if you visit it today, it's pristine. But all of that is to say that when I sat down with Ed, I said, Dr. Harrell, I called him at the time, I'd really like to do something on Elvis. He was a Pentecostal Southern boy like me, very influential. And I remember what Ed said. He said, Elvis isn't going anywhere. And he was exactly right. Because here I am, writing articles and working on the Elvis book even today, and people are still interested. So he said, what you really ought to do is Pentecostalism. And I had worked with him just to get my feet wet. I had gone up into Kansas. It was about a 2-hour drive away. I'd gone to Baxter Springs, Kansas, which was where Parham ended up. Had gone over to Oral Roberts University and worked in their library. Eventually would spend a lot of time in Springfield, Missouri, which was just 2 hours away as well. And all of these places turned out to be sort of, evidence of God's grace, I suppose, is that I was in the right place at the right time. Sources were available. I was close by. And I had a good mentor like Ed, who essentially said, this Parham guy that you've been talking a little bit about, he said, that's good. That's interesting. He said, because Pentecostal history is beginning to grow. It already was. I mean, he can see it. And a lot of work in the late 60s and early 70s. And here we are in the early 80s. And he said, no one's really done anything on Parham. Why don't you make a trip or two up there and keep looking at the evidence and see if there's enough to do a dissertation. So I did an article, got it published actually in Kansas History in '84, and I discovered exactly what he thought, that if you dug deep enough, the materials were there. They were in Baxter Springs, they were in Springfield, they were in Tulsa, in ORU, and I knew enough about Pentecostalism to do Parham. That was part of it. I had to learn a lot about the Midwest. That was new to me because I was not from the Midwest. But over the course of my 4 years at Arkansas, I made several trips to Kansas as well as Missouri. Parham was somewhat of an itinerant preacher in and around that area called the tri-state area of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. There was a big lead mining industry there at the turn of the 20th century. And that's where he held a lot of his revivals. Also from there, of course, I made a big trip down into Texas, where he also spent a lot of time. And so that's how I got into Parham. And I'm really humbled, Josh, by the fact that here it is over 30 years later, and we're still talking about the book. So I think any of us that get into academia, we just want to make a difference, like anybody else. And so to have your work maybe influencing others and helping others, that means a lot. So I'm very thankful.
Yeah. And so, Parham's was huge, when you want to understand the Pentecostal movement, right? And, here's the thing, as you mentioned, it's one of the fastest, largest Christian traditions on the planet right now. And if you really want to understand the identity of that movement, you have to understand its history. And, I didn't mention, you're the chair of history, right? At Appalachian State University.
Appalachian State, that's right.
Yeah. So, you understand history so crucial. And so, I'm going to read a little quote from page 164 in your book. And I want you to kind of unpack that a little bit. Here's what you say. It was Parham alone who formulated the distinguishing ideological formula of tongues as initial evidence for Holy Spirit baptism. That discovery, in effect, created the Pentecostal movement. It set Pentecostals apart from the overall pneumatic revival by tying them to a stricter theological creed, and more than any other feature, served as their identifying badge within an often hostile community of Christian denominations. Parham also infused the movement with a zeal for missions. Xenoglossic tongues provided the key to an end times missions thrust, which would close the last of God's historical dispensations, the church age. End quote. You make a huge point about Parham's crucial role for Pentecostals. Can you tell me a little bit about Parham, his place in Pentecostal history, maybe, and how it affects our identity? And so, maybe for some listeners, maybe even some who are younger, older, who've never really been introduced to Parham, maybe they go to a Pentecostal church or they heard about Pentecostals. Can you tell us a little bit, a brief bio on Parham and why it's helpful to understand Parham to understand Pentecostals?
Sure, Josh. One of the things that made Parham intriguing as a young scholar was that he had been overlooked. A lot of the early works on Pentecostalism simply didn't mention his name. One of the very first did, one that was actually published in 1914 by Charles Shumway. But then as the Pentecostals themselves began to write about their history, they leave him out. Or if they talk about him, they refer to, there was a man from Kansas. That raised a lot of interesting questions. It became somewhat of a detective story. Why is it they're straying from Parham? And there were these rumors that he had fallen away, he had sinned a great sin, and nobody really knew exactly what it was. There was all of that, which made it intriguing. And I think for those of us that are historians, there's a little bit of a detective in all of us. By the time I came along, some books in the beginning in the 60s and in the 70s, Parham's name did resurface. He's in Sinan's book, he's in Claude Kendrick's book, a number of others. So people knew he was there. They just didn't know much about him. And they knew that he had fallen into disrepute, but they weren't quite sure. I remember hearing lots of rumors. Did he have an affair? There was a rumor, that he was homosexual. That there were just a number of these unsubstantiated rumors. Nobody really knew at the time exactly what the problem had been. That's not unique to Pentecostal history. There was a guy named Benjamin H. Irwin in the fire baptized movement, who had also sort of emerged as a key figure and then disappeared. But people knew that story. He had been seen coming out of a house of ill repute. He came out of a house of prostitution, and he was seen, and he lost his position in the church. And then I think he eventually did get back into the ministry, repented, and so on and so on. But with Parham, none of that was true. I mean, he was a minister. He stayed in the church. He just was ignored somewhat. Baxter Springs, little small place in the middle of the country, small following. But a lot of things were clear as I studied him. I mean, he had the first magazine for Pentecostals, was the first person to sort of widely use the term apostolic faith. Seymour had clearly been influenced by him. And so people knew Seymour, they knew Azusa Street, but Parham had faded away. Parham went to Azusa Street, but he didn't stay. By then, this whole controversy was beginning to unfold. So there was all of that, which I'll get back to in just a moment. But the main thing I think that you referred to with that quote just a moment ago was that as a historian, I had to make a choice. What defines Pentecostalism? And in its earliest days, Pentecostalism was part of this larger sort of amorphous movement of holiness folks that talked about sanctification. In fact, in the late 19th century, terms like sanctification and baptism of the Holy Spirit were synonymous. They really meant a kind of additional blessing beyond salvation and conversion.
So like an experience, like
right.
now I feel holy. Like
right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And it had come mostly out of the Methodist Church, what I referred to earlier as a theology of a second definite work. But non-Methodists talked about holiness too. They used different terms, talked about Christian perfection, holiness, the power, power for service. There were any number of ways that this sort of holiness community talked about the power of God, and they also saw it in this larger sense of the coming of the end, the end times. So Parham is very much influenced by all of that. He was a Methodist. He left the Methodist Church as a young preacher. He grew up he was born in Iowa, moved to Kansas as a small boy. And I was interested in his family. I mean, they were sort of middle class, working class farmers. They weren't poor. but they certainly weren't wealthy. But that was also interesting because it had been people talked about Pentecostals as being from the other side of the tracks. We're sort of black and white poor folk, and Parham kind of questioned that to some degree. I mean, it's not that, there was a lot of poverty among early Pentecostals, but I think there were historians who were seeing the poverty as the driving force behind Pentecostalism. And I became convinced that that really wasn't true, that they were working class folks who were influenced by something else. And this is another thing why Parham is important. He's in Kansas, in that Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri setting where populism is so important in the 1890s. And he's a farmer, so he's influenced by a lot of those same things.
What do you mean by populism? What do you mean by populism?
Well, populism is an American political movement, sort of political social movement that for a time, threatened the two-party system in the United States. The populists were very successful in the 1892 election, sending a number of representatives to Washington, to the House of Representatives. They actually captured several Midwest state houses. And they were sort of, I hesitate to use the word because people get the wrong idea, but there's certain elements of socialism that they brought into their agenda. There was anger at the railroads. So they sometimes argued for, government control of the railroads, or at least government regulation of railroad rates, so that farmers who lived near the railroad didn't profit while farmers who lived away from the railroad suffered. There was all of that going on as America went through a very tough time of growing industrialization. The farm prices were up and down, up and down, up and down. There tended to be about every decade a depression of some sort, and so working people were much more open to new ideas and political radicalism, and that's essentially what populism was. There are debates among historians about how radical it really was, but the language could be quite radical, certainly in the 1890s. And one reason that is that populism is ultimately addressed by both of the political parties, by the Republicans through someone like Theodore Roosevelt, by the Democrats through Woodrow Wilson. So what happens is the populist agenda is eventually captured by the more middle-class educated progressives. That was one of the early historians of populism put it this way. He said that the populists went skinny dipping, and while they were swimming, the progressives came along and stole their clothes. So it gives you some sense. But of course, the progressive movement in the first 20 years of the 20th century, while it incorporated a lot of the same ideas, it didn't have the radical sense of populism, in part because it wasn't fueled by the same people. Somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, educated elites who are essentially looking to change the system in order to protect it.
So you said Parham was attracted to that group,
yes, I think Parham is from that class. Now I looked long and hard, and a lot of other historians have, to see if there's a direct connection between populism and Pentecostalism, and I think in general the answer to that is probably not. In other words, you can't draw a one-to-one connection that populists became Pentecostals, but Pentecostals, early Pentecostals like Parham, are oftentimes in settings where they're influenced by populism. Populism was strongest in the rural Midwest and in the rural South. And much of Pentecostalism is going to be influenced by those two areas. So now, why is all of that important? Well, it's important because, early Pentecostals are people who are seeking in the same way that populists are people who are they're seeking the right answer, in this case, a political, social, cultural answer. And Pentecostals like Parham are seeking the religious answer. I called my book Fields White Unto Harvest because I did want to get to that millenarian theme there, that there's a sense that as the world moved toward 1900 in particular, moved toward the 20th century, that something big was about to happen. And that this was going to be the century that Christ would return.
Okay.
And so in the book, I talk about bookends, that the Pentecostal movement saw itself in this same light, that at the beginning of the church, on the day of Pentecost, they were speaking in tongues. There was a great revival, 3,000 people saved under Peter's ministry on the day of Pentecost. And so they believed that there would be at the end of time, or the end of the church age, right before Christ returns, a similar kind of outpouring of the Spirit, outpouring of power, and a similar conversion package. And so that's what fuels Parham. And I think ultimately tongues becomes part of that package. Most Pentecostals don't eventually believe, now Parham continued to believe throughout his life, that real tongue speech was an actual language, and that it was given by the Holy Spirit so that people could preach, that they could go to other countries, and they could, without having to take the time to learn a language, they could let God speak through them, and there would be this massive worldwide revival at the end of time before Jesus comes to take his children home. Most Pentecostals believed that initially, though. And that's where I think Parham is important. You have to understand not what Pentecostalism became, but what it was. There's a process through there. Eventually, most Pentecostals come to believe that tongue speech is not xenoglossa, known foreign speech, but glossolalia, speaking in tongues, speaking in a heavenly language. And so where I tied it together was to argue that even though Parham and other Pentecostals of his generation, while they misunderstood what tongue speech really was, that they nonetheless fueled it with this end time zeal, a zeal for missions. For instance, you look at a group like the Assemblies of God, even today, the largest of the American traditional Pentecostal denominations, they spend something like 2/3 of their budget on missions. I mean, it's a huge percentage, and that's typical of Pentecostals throughout the 20th and 21st century, that they're mission driven. So Fields White Unto Harvest, they saw the opportunity, and they believed that God was using them to reach the last generation. So that's why Parham's important, because he gives us a sense of what early Pentecostals really were. And then in one final little comment, Parham is the one, he's not the one who sort of creates it. I think he sort of runs into it, but he's the one who pieces things together, that speaking in tongues, it's not the only evidence, but it's become sort of the only evidence that really matters. Pentecostals call it the initial evidence. The sine qua non, the evidence that's always there. Parham first heard tongue speech apparently when he visited Frank Sanford's Shiloh community up in Maine. In 1900. He heard it. He probably had been putting things together in his mind about some of the things I just talked about, the end of time, and so he hadn't spoken in tongues, but he had heard it and he was aware of it. And so the revival in Topeka on that sort of culminates on January 1, 1901, in which Agnes Osmond speaks in tongues. I think to some degree Parham had been preparing his students for that. Because he thought that was sort of what the scriptures were pointing to, and what God was getting ready to do.
We often hear the story that, he went away for a while and got his students to study the book of Acts and to see what is the evidence of Spirit baptism. Right. And do you think he was like, he already knew and he's like prepping his students to kind of experience it? Or was he genuinely just trying to, hey, as a community, let's see what the evidence of Spirit baptism is?
Well, I'll tell you what, I was at a meeting this summer where university officials were talking about, okay, so we have these plans, we have these important goals, we want to convince faculty that this is what we need to do. And the question came up among some of the younger chairs. Well, do I let my faculty decide what they want to do, or do they vote on it, or do I just sort of tell them what the policy is? And I spoke up, having been chair at that point in time for over 7 years, and I said, my approach has always been to let faculty vote, but I don't take a vote unless I sort of know what the answer is going to be. In other words, I said that to say this. I think good leaders prepare. They know the direction that they think things ought to go. And yes, they let people vote, make up their mind. But if you're a good leader, you sort of know the direction you're going. I think Parham was doing that. I think he had a pretty good idea given the places he told him to look, look in Acts, that he sort of knew what the answers were going to be. I'm not saying he was totally disingenuous. I'm just saying he was a good teacher.
Yeah.
And a good teacher doesn't ask a question. They don't have a pretty good idea what the answer is going to be.
Right. He's not saying, go check in the book of Revelation.
Right.
He's like checking the book of Acts.
I have no idea. That's not what most of us do. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Agnes is the first to speak in tongues, right? Among his followers. Yeah. As you said, Parham had built, he had been a Methodist minister for a time in the mid 1890s. Then he left the Methodist Church. He believed they were becoming too socially prominent. And it's true that the Methodists were moving away from their holiness roots, and Parham was clearly in the holiness camp. So he became an independent holiness preacher and founded a healing home in Topeka that was quite well known. It was a street ministry, and people would come there to be prayed for and to study healing and the theology of healing. And then Parham left it, just abruptly left it. Interesting.
There was no scandal or anything at that point. He left it under the control of a couple of other ministers, and he went on this search, as you said, for about 6 months. He traveled around and went to other ministries, and that's the point at which he's looking. That's when he goes to Shiloh. I think when he first hears tongue speech and begins to formulate some of his ideas. So then he comes back to Topeka, is what you're referring to, and he forms a Bible school.
Right.
So he doesn't go back to the healing home, but he's in the same city, and he gets this really elaborate mansion that locals called Stone's Folly. It was a sort of a real elaborate house that a guy had started to build and never finished. And he rents it for very cheap and has a Bible school. And that's where he has his students study about the evidence for Holy Spirit baptism. And that's what, and that's where the revival occurs. As you said, they start off as a watch night service, and it goes for a couple of days, apparently, not just December 31st, 1900, but January 1st, 1901. And it actually was January 1, the night of January 1, 1901, that Agnes Osmond speaks in tongues.
Yeah. It's pretty significant.
It's been recorded. That was another thing I ran into. It had been recorded, maybe because it was so romantic, that some people say, well, last day of the century, which is not really true anyway, because those people that are really in the math know that it's 1900 is the end, and others would say no, it's 1899. But technically, December 31st, 1900 ended the century, and January 1, 1901 is the first day of the 20th century. And so
and that's the day she spoke in tongues.
Yes, it had been variously written. Some people remembered it as December 31st, 1900. Others remembered it as January 1, 1901. The best evidence from the newspapers when they covered it, the best evidence is it was actually January 1.
Cool. Wow.
It's reported in the press on the second and third, first few days of January 1901.
Did everyone speak in tongues at his school?
Not everyone.
Okay.
Agnes Osmond was first, and then other students began to. Eventually, Parham does, but no, there are students who leave the school, and some continue to seek. So I mean, it would be pretty much what you would think in any revival,
Right.
but it did get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
For the first time, they get newspaper press,
Hmm.
and it's negative in a way, but like any person sort of knows, all publicity is good publicity. It put a mark on
Yeah.
Stone's Folly and Parham's ministry. Stone's Folly, it's going to peter out over the course of the next few months. Parham, there was the death of a young child, and that kind of put a damper on things. Parham probably struggled with, why God didn't heal the young baby, but he didn't quit. He doesn't.
And this was his child. Is his child?
Right? No,
Yeah.
it's not. It's not his
Okay.
child. It's
Okay.
It's one of the children in the group.
Okay.
That had been prayed for. I think I'm right about that. Go back and look. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
But then, just to complete this part of the story, so there sort of ups and downs of Parham's early ministry, even after the founding of the Pentecostal movement, if you date it to January 1, 1901. Right. And so then there's a lull in there, but Parham, true to this zeal, Parham and his students don't stay in Topeka. They go to Kansas City. They go out and they preach this message. And you know that from the newspaper accounts. They met with limited success in most places. Then in 1904, Parham has a big revival in the Galena area, which is where there's a lot of the lead mining I was talking about before.
Oh, okay.
So he resurfaces and he gets a lot of popular press because he goes back to the healing ministry. He's still preaching, baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues, but there are several healings that occur, and that's what tends to fuel the attention. Same thing would happen again in 1905 in Houston, Texas. More than anything else, it's the healings that drive the press.
Oh, okay.
But still, that's where Seymour is going to meet Parham and hear his message of tongue speech as the initial evidence. So there are really two different stories going on. One is what the press focuses on. The press tended to focus on the miraculous things, tongue speech a little bit, but then once that faded out, it was the healings. And apparently in Houston in 1905, a very prominent woman claimed healing, and that raised Parham's stakes for a while. But he never stays in any place very long. He moves around. Yeah.
So, so if you're spirit baptized, you begin to speak in tongues. And as you said, they get a known language that, correct me if I'm wrong or right, is that language tells you where you need to go around the world. Like, so if you speak Mandarin or Cantonese, you go to China or something like that. Would that be accurate or inaccurate?
Well, there was a lot of speculation about that. Let's just say that the evidence suggests that while there may have been a word here or there, and in the book I talk about, the psychological things that go on. I mean, these areas are much more diverse than we probably think. The mining industry, for instance, brought people in, immigrants from different parts of the world. Los Angeles in 1906 at Azusa Street, same way. You got lots of languages. So it's certainly possible, and I think maybe likely, that there were some words spoken when people spoke in tongues that were real words or sounded like real words. Certainly there are testimonies of people who say they heard their language. So you either believe them or you don't. But in terms of what the Pentecostals are doing, they don't typically know the language. They speculate sometimes that it might be Chinese or it might be Mandarin, but pretty soon, and this is where Parham is an exception because he doesn't go here, but within a few years, most Pentecostals come to believe that these are unknown languages.
Unknown, okay.
Yeah.
And did Parham take that position eventually as well?
No.
He never
Parham
did.
continues to believe, and part of it, I think, is the battle that he gets into. He's convinced that the people who are against him have a sort of fake, so it's fake languages and that they're just making it up or whatever. But there are a lot of examples. My friend who now passed away, Gary McGee, did a lot of work about early Pentecostal missionaries who traveled around the globe believing that they had the gift of language. And they found out pretty quickly that didn't work. They would go to China, they'd go to India, they'd go to places and speak in tongues, and people just sort of looked at them like, and they may have been influenced maybe by the excitement of the whole thing, but they weren't hearing their language.
Right.
So Pentecostals pretty quickly, those who go to different places around the globe, Africa, Latin America, they literally went everywhere. It's pretty amazing. They cobbled together the funds and they went, but they found out pretty quickly, I've got to do more than this. I've got to study and learn the language. And even so, they spread the message of Pentecostalism almost from the beginning around the globe. But you mentioned Parham. Parham never changes his mind. He's one of the few who continues to believe that real tongue speech is xenoglossic, foreign language. And I had some people, who'd say to me, well, then if that's true, Parham can't be the founder. But I rejected that in the sense that I think the real connection is tying tongue speech to the experience, and also tying the foreign missions zeal, which Parham clearly does. Right. So the fact that he's kind of the lone wolf in never changing his mind about that, I don't think changes his importance in the origins of the movement, because it did clearly come as a missions-oriented end-time movement.
Do you know when he spoke in tongues, and did he ever describe his experience of it?
I would have to go back and look exactly which day. I think it was just a few days after Agnes Osman that he does. It's during that same revival. Yeah. And he talks about the power of God coming over him, but but nothing. One of the other things I should say, one of the sad things is that those earliest editions of the apostolic faith, there aren't many of them around. There was when Parham started the apostolic faith in 1898 when he was at the healing home, the Bethel Healing Home.
And apostolic faith covers kind of like a movement of people associated with this kind of approach to spirit baptism in tongues. Would that be correct?
Well, except it predates that. Apostolic faith is a term Parham was using in the late 1890s. And by that, he meant, it sort of unpacked the term, the apostles. We are getting back here at the end of time to the kind of zeal and the kind of presence of God and his spirit and the moving of his spirit that the apostles had on the day of Pentecost. So that first generation is now being recreated by the Spirit for the last end time revival. And speaking in tongues was a sign of that whole thing. So Parham is using that term long before Topeka, and he's using it as on the masthead of his journal, beginning in 1898, 1899. I forget exactly. It may be early 1899. So when he leaves the healing home, that comes to an end. But there's pretty much a complete year and a half or so run that is pre-Pentecostal using that term. Then when he goes and comes back and forms the school, and Agnes Osman speaks in tongues and a revival, he will occasionally publish a magazine, but he probably doesn't do many of them. There are none that I know of from 1901, 1902. I think the earliest one that I've seen is about 1903, 1904. And there's just a scattered copy. He just will do these tracts, little short papers, and he will use them as part of his publicity. By 1905, he's doing more, 1906, but really there's a big gap in there from about 1900 until 1910. And so they're sporadic, and I was able to locate a handful. But from 1910 until his death in 1929, he continues to publish that journal regularly. So we know what he thought in the beginning and what he thought at the end, and speculate a lot about what he thought in those critical years.
Okay. That's really helpful, actually. Really helpful.
And it's also a tie, Josh, to the fact that that when Seymour went to Azusa Street, he uses the same name.
He does use the same name.
And in that first edition of the Apostolic Faith, he says Charles Parham is the projector of this movement. So he linked himself to Parham. Now, that doesn't last very long. Parham comes to Azusa Street. There's a split between the two men. Parham doesn't like what he sees, probably doesn't think he's given enough credit and enough authority. There probably was some racism. I think there's a lot of things that are going on there. But Seymour figures out real quickly that Parham is not going to be the head of this movement in Los Angeles. And so they don't talk about Parham anymore. But they do continue to use the term. So the influence of Parham is clearly there from the beginning. And for a time, the two men did, in fact, get along quite well. Unfortunately, it doesn't last.
Because Parham did teach Seymour about the connection between spirit baptism and tongues, right? Like early.
Yes, Parham, and you know, I've been criticized a lot on this. Parham was from Kansas. His views on race in the context of the time were actually pretty enlightened. They're not our views. But my position as a historian has always been, it doesn't make much sense to go back and put our values on those folks. You need to understand those people within their time. In other words, if we say that everybody is a racist, then in a sense, nobody is a racist, because we don't have a context for knowing what racism means. So I draw a distinction between the Parham of the 1890s and early 1900s, who was actually pretty open on race, certainly in the context of the day. Even among early Pentecostals, I draw a line, for instance, between Parham and his Texas associate, William Carruthers, whose views on race were much harder than Parham. So Parham preaches in Black communities. He licenses and ordains Black preachers in Kansas and in Texas. But he gets criticized in hindsight, because when Seymour wants to come to the school there, Parham is in Houston, and there are segregation laws in Texas in 1905, 1906. And so Parham allows Seymour to attend, apparently by sitting in the next room. Rather than sitting in with the white students.
So in another room, like sometimes I get the picture of, like, was he in the hallway? The door was open. Some people's I don't know, like
there's actually been people who have questioned that account.
Okay.
But that's the only account that I've ever really seen, is that Parham allowed Seymour to sit with a door open. Does that mean he's sitting in the door, sort of away from, I mean, you think about segregation laws and you think about movie theaters, there were galleries, and the Black folks sat in the galleries and the white folks sat down in the main part. So it's not that, under segregation laws, you would have to be in a different room as such, but you would have to be clearly segregated. But the story is that the door was open, and Seymour either sat in the next room or perhaps sat in the doorway, so that he would be separate, segregated from the other students. And Parham did that because those are the segregation laws at the time. It may be because other people in his group preferred that. It may be that Parham didn't want to break the law, or maybe he thought that was the right thing to do. My argument's always been, if you understand Parham in the context of the day, he goes into the Black community, he preaches, he ordains, he fellowships, but he's not what we would want him to be in terms of being equal and saying God's love and grace covers us all. He did say that in the sense that he believed that Black people were God's people too, that they deserved the gospel, that they could be equally saved, sanctified, filled with the Holy Spirit. But he accepted the segregation rule. He didn't buck those rules. He was a bit more open in Kansas than he was in Texas, so I think that's part of the story. Then I'll go ahead and say one other thing, because I was criticized for this, but I was trying to be fair to Parham and understand Parham in the context of his day. There's a very different Parham that emerges by about 1910, 1912.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Parham who uses racist language that he
Mm.
had not used before.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Parham that is very harsh. Now he had views about race. He clearly believed in white superiority, but he, within that context early on, he was kind, he was paternalistic, but he saw it as his mission to preach to the Black community as well as the white community. Why did Parham change? This is an interesting parallel with populism. People who study populism know that in 1896, the vice presidential candidate for the populists was a fellow named I can't think of it now. Tom Watson.
Okay.
And Tom Watson was a Georgia farmer, white, who was at the time in the 1890s as a populist, populist political leader, fellowship with Blacks, urged Blacks to vote for the populist party, essentially talked about overcoming the racial divide. It's the man, it's the political man who's keeping us down by dividing us by race. All right, that's Tom Watson in the 1890s. Then you get Tom Watson in and about World War I, and he is a fire-breathing Democratic racist. So what happens? Well, these populists who are influenced by the progressive ideas of their day, some of them, certainly Watson, changed over the 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And it may be the fear of the world that they were living in. Maybe they envisioned a kind of racist or a sort of racial harmony that would have made it clearer that whites were in charge, and then they got scared that wasn't going to be the case. I don't know. I think it's a complicated mix of things. Clearly, the country was becoming more racist by 1920, not less, but more racist than it had been, interestingly enough. Most of the Jim Crow laws emerge in the 1890s, and it becomes hardened by World War I. So in some ways, Parham, was he influenced by all of those things? Probably. He was a child of the Midwest. But I think in Parham's case, I think he was also influenced by his fall. The fact that at some point in here, beginning about 1906, he's beginning to be charged with immoral activities. And one of the things I was able to discover in my research was exactly what it was. It was charges of a homosexual relationship with a young man who was his singer, one of his singers who traveled with him. I talk about it in the book. He was charged in San Antonio, Texas in summer of 1907. There's some evidence that these charges might have been floating around for a while. Now, keep in mind that he had already gone to Azusa and broken with Seymour prior to this. Was it part of that? No direct evidence. It might have been. Parham was also, the one thing I haven't talked about, he was vying for control of a much bigger fish than Azusa at the time. He didn't know what the future would hold. In the end, we know that Azusa is going to be huge in terms of its influence on the world. But at the time, in 1905, 1906, it looked like Zion City, Illinois, which was the legacy of a faith healer by the name of John Alexander Dowie, who was a big hit at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago and set up his own little commune there in a place called Zion City, north of Chicago. And Dowie is in poor health and dies in early 1907. And Parham is there preaching and vying for control of Zion City.
Wow.
And he's up against one of Dowie's disciples, a fellow by the name of Wilbur Vollivan. Now, there are those in the Parham camp who believe that all the charges against Parham were creations from his opponents in Zion City. Volava. I don't believe that, but I do believe that they took advantage of it. I do believe that they exaggerated it, that they published it over and over and over again. So you put those three things together, Josh, within the course of a year, Parham, whose star had been on the rise slowly but surely since 1901, is now losing a battle in Zion City for control of that religious community, losing a battle for control of Azusa in Los Angeles. He's in Texas, and he's formally charged and taken to jail on a charge of sodomy.
Wow.
And all those things happened within a year. Now,
he actually went to jail for that.
He spent a night or two in jail. Yeah.
Okay.
Charges were ultimately dropped.
Okay.
I tried my best to get to the bottom of this. That's the detective part. I mean, I searched through records in San Antonio. There was a courthouse fire. Records don't exist anymore. But I was also told by the clerk of court there that typically when a charge was dropped, and it clearly was dropped because the newspapers reported that those records would have been expunged anyway.
Oh, okay.
So there may not have been any. But I wanted to see what the testimony was.
Right.
The only testimony that we have are third hand coming from the Wilbur Volava camp in Zion City, Illinois. They published it. Right. And you've got people saying all sorts of things, but you don't have the firsthand accounts. The newspaper accounts are pretty straightforward. Parham was charged with sodomy. The young man's name was J.J. Jordan. He was charged. He was put in jail. He was able to post through a couple of friends, I think $1,000 bond. Wow. That's a substantial amount of money at the time. So he had people who continued to believe in him, obviously. But then the charges were dropped.
Interesting.
Parham always denied it. His followers denied it. But there are a lot of people who liked Parham, who believed that there was something to it. And that's kind of where the story ends. You know, in that there's a lot of smoke there. You know, Parham continued to preach. He was married. He had 5 kids. By all indication, in the community in which he lived, he was respected. Did he do something? Was it a short-term thing? Did he repent? Parham claimed it was always made up. So
interesting.
Can't answer those questions.
Yeah.
You got Parham's story and you got his opponents.
Yeah.
And of course, the community of Pentecostalism as well as I do. It was a bit uncomfortable in the early 1980s, going around interviewing people who had known Parham, who were in their 90s, and asking them about this.
Wow.
And many of them had never heard it.
Interesting.
Never heard these stories, and said, I wouldn't believe that. And yet there were others who broke with Parham over it, who clearly did believe.
Oh, okay.
That there was something to it.
Interesting.
So now I'll say one other thing. One of the other reasons why I got interested in Parham is that I took the position that it didn't really matter. I mean, I wanted to find out the details of this whole story, and I found out a lot of it. But in my mind, Parham was important. Yeah. And deserved to be remembered, regardless of the answers to any of these things.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Wow, that's a lot of helpful information. I really appreciate that. This gets back to that, the origin story of Pentecostalism, and so, you got the controversies related to Parham, and, early on, we know that Pentecostal just said, hey, it was just a work of the Spirit. That's how the movement started. And then later on, people said, hey, it's William Seymour because, he popularized Pentecostalism through the Azusa Street revival. Right. Some other scholars say, well, it's actually, the various revival centers around the world in relationship with Azusa. That's kind of what, propelled, the Pentecostal movement. That's where the origin story is. But you're kind of going to say, hey, no, it's Parham is there. How do you respond to the various ways of people trying to understand the kind of the origins of the modern day Pentecostal movement?
I think as a historian, I was reacting against some of what you just referred to, Josh, is the sort of romantic idea that Pentecostalism was a movement without a founder. It used to be, in the language of the time, a movement without a man, was what people would say back in the 60s and 70s. And clearly, I'm a believer, but I believe God uses men and women. So there's always a man or a woman or some of both that God is using. And we're still human even after God uses us. We're subject to fall. We've seen that in our own day, and we will continue to see it. That the devil continues to tempt, and sometimes people fail, and hopefully they repent. So I was convinced that was the story, that it wasn't just the Holy Spirit moving and with this sort of nameless, faceless group of people. There were names and there were faces and there were stories. And so Parham was a part of that. I think he was the key to putting the theological formula together, the theological formula that Seymour adopted. I don't argue that he was the only founder or the only important person. Certainly, Seymour had a greater impact of sending out missionaries around the world. Parham's movement, because of the scandal, because he had cut himself off from Azusa, Parham's influence after 1906 becomes very small. It's not gone, but it's small. It's in Texas and Kansas, pretty much, small areas. Seymour's influence becomes huge in that people leave Azusa and they go out and they carry the message. Now, of course, even Seymour to some degree falls victim to this ultimately. The revival comes to an end after a few years, and people remember Azusa and they might remember Seymour, but it's not a single organization. Maybe that does tell us something from a religious standpoint, that you can't control God. You can't control the work of the Spirit. As a believer, I certainly believe that. And so you see that in the work of the Pentecostal movement. But Parham was an important part of the picture of the theology coming together. Now, the theology changes and shifts. One of the things that I didn't like, and I never really, as a historian, knew how to respond to it. Shortly before I published my book, Douglas Nelson had written the first really good account of Seymour. And then later, of course, Mel Robeck's work, I think, even more important on Seymour. But Doug Nelson took this idea that it wasn't tongue speech, it was really this racial harmony.
Right.
It's part of his, it was really the racial
Seymour
harmony.
had that racial harmony at Azusa Street.
And that defines Pentecostalism. And I argue, well, the problem with that is, that it doesn't last. I mean, it's there for a brief period of time, and we might be proud of that as Pentecostals. We might look to that as what God wanted all along. But Pentecostals are influenced by their society, by the segregation in their midst, by the racism. And so life goes on. And now, when I was a kid growing up in Eastern North Carolina, we would sometimes have maybe a Black preacher come speak at our predominantly, well, it was all white church at the time, Pentecostal Holiness Church. But we were probably unique. I doubt too many local Baptist churches, Methodist churches had Black preachers come in. We did, but there were guest speakers. We might have a choir or something, and we would occasionally have maybe a Black family who was visiting, and they saw it was Pentecostal. And but it was awkward. It just wasn't the way things were done in the 60s. Things are very different today than they were. My home church is now integrated, not largely so, but there are Black members of the church, and it's not a big deal. But we still live in a world where we have predominantly Black and predominantly white denominations. So I can talk about Kojic, which has white members, but it's predominantly Black. I can talk about
Church of God in Christ.
Holiness. Yeah, Church of God in Christ. I can talk about Pentecostal Holiness, which is predominantly white but has Black members. I think internationally you see a better picture, because these churches like the AG, Pentecostal Holiness, much larger overseas than they are in the United States. So if you go outside the United States, they really are integrated. and in some parts around the world, they may in fact be predominantly a church of color. But in the United States, there has still been much of that tradition, and it's complicated. It's related to worship style, worship traditions, leadership roles, all those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I just sort of thought that was a little bit too romantic. It's not that I was saying it didn't happen. I think it did happen.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of whites who went to Azusa who felt convicted about their racism and embraced people of color as brothers and sisters in Christ for the first time. And they went back home, and no doubt they took that message, but it didn't really stick. We still had to go through the civil rights movement. We still had to go through an epiphany of events, you see, for God to lead us down that road. So I just didn't think it made a whole lot of sense to see Pentecostalism as something that was important, but wasn't the only thing. So I stuck with the theology.
Yeah.
Even though Parham himself, his specific views did not become the norm, but tongue speech as the key initial evidence did stick, as did the missionary zeal. So that's why I kind of saw Parham as a key figure, but certainly not the only key figure.
So you would see it as like a multiplicity of founders, and or like, I don't know,
what language would you use? Have to decide.
Pioneers.
You have to decide what you're looking at. I mean, I think Parham was a theological founder, but I think Seymour was the founder who spread the message. And without Seymour, you don't have Pentecostalism spreading around the world. It becomes a localized Parham movement that probably dies out. So clearly, it kind of depends on the spin you want to put on it. You could also argue, for instance, that without Amy Semple McPherson in the 1920s, now she's not a charismatic, but she certainly lays the groundwork for much of what becomes the charismatic movement. I just think that Pentecostalism is a movement much bigger than one person, one set of ideas. The larger Pentecostal movement incorporates the majority of the charismatic movement today. So, I was arguing that the traditional Pentecostal denominations are indebted to Parham for their theological framework. By the time you get to the charismatic movement in the 1960s, they don't accept tongue speech as the initial evidence.
Right.
So I certainly wouldn't argue that Parham was the founder of the larger charismatic world of Pentecostalism, because there's not. Now, did he influence the entire Spirit movement? Yes.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the only one.
You come from a place of faith, right? And not all scholars who study Pentecostalism or its history would do so. Can you tell us maybe some lessons that people who can, who may be leaders or scholars or just people who attend church can learn from Charles Parham's life? What any lessons as a person of faith that you take from his story?
That's an interesting question. I'm pretty sure I can answer it very good. I mean, I look back at Parham and I see some things that I admire. That he was a person who certainly was full of zeal. He was a person who went out, spread the message, didn't mind being criticized. But there are other parts of Parham that I look at and I think, I wish he'd pulled back. I mean, he could be harsh. He could almost invite criticism sometime, maybe a little bit of a martyr complex. No. So there are parts of Parham that I think as a Christian I admire, and parts that I don't admire. But God uses flawed human beings. I look back on my life now. Back when I thought I was supposed to be a chaplain, and I eventually gave up my credentials as a minister in the Pentecostal Church. Not because I didn't want to be a minister. I just felt like that God had led me down a different path. And if you know anything about the Pentecostal Church, if you're a member of the PH ministry, you're a member of a conference and you pay your tithes to the conference. And that's where, and so when I ended up here in Boone at Appalachian State, I wanted to serve in the local church. And I actually now go to a Christian Missionary Alliance
Okay.
fellowship. And I'm very, very happy to feel like God has used me there. I'm still a Pentecostal. My beliefs haven't changed very much. So I'm in CMA is one of those old holiness groups from the late 19th century. And there's some Pentecostals there. I'm not the only one.
You still hold, do you hold to the spirit baptism with tongues?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's how I grew up. It's not that I don't think God works in other ways in other people's, but I know how he worked in my life.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's a little bit of us, especially as we get older, we cling to those things that are the foundations of our faith.
Yeah.
But I'm an evangelical Bible believing Christian first and foremost.
Yeah.
And I fellowship with other evangelical Bible believing Christians. But yes, I let people at my church know that I'm from a Pentecostal background and I believe in the work of the Spirit. But I look back on my life and I think, I couldn't have gotten to where I am now if God hadn't led me. And in other words, I look back and I say, okay, so you felt like you were called to preach and you were a preacher for a time and you preached in some youth revivals and stuff. And some people came to know Christ through that. So God clearly used me. The fact that I then became an academic doing American church history, does that mean that I somehow walked away from that call? And I don't think so. I think I could not have become an academic looking at my background, relatively poor working class folks. I mean, most of our folks didn't go to college. I know what a PhD was or what a life of an academic was, but God used the different things in my life to lead me here.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, though, I just felt like the credentials were not being used. So I serve as a deacon in the CMA church now, something that I could not have done if I had held on to my credentials.
Right.
But if people ask me to preach, I proclaim the gospel as best I know how. I'm certainly not the best preacher that I've ever heard, but maybe I'm not the worst, whatever that means. I've always believed, you just let God use you. And if you're honest and you're humble, God will find a way to use you. And I hope he's used me as an academic. I've certainly enjoyed what I've been able to do, and not just with Pentecostalism, but with gospel music.
Yeah.
Met a lot of nice people, met a lot of Christian folks. And I'm just very thankful that here toward the end of my life, I feel like God led me. And I worried too often, sometimes we want to know ahead of time. I always have. And if I would change anything about my life, I think I would just be a little more content to let God work and trust him that I didn't need to know everything along the way. Sometimes you look back on the journey and you see much more clearly than when you were in the midst of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's really helpful. You shared so much. Thank you so much for being so generous and just helping us understand Parham. You also got another book, right? Close Harmony, A History of Southern Gospel as well. Yeah.
Yes, I do. It's up here on the shelf up here behind me. It's a look at the Southern Gospel Quartets. It came out in 2002. I did a lot of work with Southern Gospel Music Association. They have a museum and Hall of Fame in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee.
Cool.
And I did that. And just looking at the different ways, 4-part harmony, 3 and 4-part harmony quartet music, both black and white, but primarily white in the industry that developed, although it becomes integrated by the early 1970s. Really, folks listening that remember really good, sort of the blend of the old traditional gospel and the new contemporary gospel, that remember a group called the Imperials in the 1970s. Boy, they were good. It was a combination of one of the Blackwoods, Terry Blackwood from the old Blackwood family, and a guy named Sherman Andrus who had sung with Andre Crouch and the Disciples. And then Jim Murray and a bass singer that had been around forever with the Weatherfords. and they got together and formed a wonderful group. I still love the music of the Imperials, but I got into Southern gospel and met a lot of really nice folks and kind of studied that. And now I want to finish this little book on
Elvis.
On Elvis, yeah.
Yeah. When's that going to come out? When do you think that's going to come out?
Well, becoming chair didn't help get the book done, I'll tell you that. But I mean, I've published a couple of articles and hope to finish a book with the Library of Religious Biography with Erdman's Press.
Yeah.
So many books have been written on Presley. Presley, I'm not arguing that Presley was an important religious figure. I think he was a person influenced by the church, influenced by Pentecostalism, as well as gospel music, a person influenced by the diversity of the 60s, a person to some degree led astray by the world that he got caught up in, certainly drugs, a number of other things, but a person who for contentment and peace kept coming back to his roots.
That's cool.
It's a tragic story in some ways.
That'd be interesting.
Elvis died at the age of 42, but I think, Elvis, I see myself a little bit sometime in there. I mean, would I have done any better if I had been given that opportunity? If I had been as talented, which I'm not, but if I had been given that, would I have handled the pressures, the temptations any better? Obviously, we would hope so, but I'm not sure. There are people who had the talent, who made choices that Elvis didn't make. I think of somebody like Pat Boone, who stayed in the faith, didn't have the meteoric career though that Elvis did. I think about Elvis, and I think about somebody like Jerry Lee Lewis, who in some ways was much more haunted by his Pentecostal background. Ironically, the last one still living, although he's in poor health. And with Jerry Lee, a person who has back and forth in the faith, out of the faith. And somebody like Elvis, somehow, maybe not as deep because of a number of things, but certainly haunted by what he knew to be right and wrong.
Interesting. Wow.
So that I'm just sort of looking at those kinds of questions and trying to wrap up some loose ends.
I'd love to. I look forward to when that comes out. I'll definitely get that. And so, hey, if you're listening today, I really encourage you to get a hold of Fields White Unto Harvest, Charles F. Parham, and the Missionary Origins of Pentecostalism. And, he also has another book, Close Harmony, A History of Southern Gospel. And of course, the book on Elvis. We'll be looking forward to getting that as well. Any concluding comments you'd like to share, Dr. Goff, before we close?
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate you remembering me from the SPS conference. Those are very kind comments you made. And I think sometimes, I've spent my whole career in a state institution. I have a local church. I enjoy the fellowship of my Christian brothers and sisters there, but I have sometimes in my work missed that. And groups like the SPS, meeting you and other young scholars and so that you can talk about the work we do, but we can also talk about the faith that we share. That is something that I have sometimes missed in the other parts of my work. And I think that's one reason why my research has always focused on Pentecostalism, gospel music, so that I've been able to fellowship as well as do my craft. So
I really appreciate that. Well, thank you so much, and say hi to your wife for me as well. She was really kind to my wife and I as well. So,
well, thank you, Josh. Remind me of your wife's name.
My wife's name's Joyce.
Joyce. Okay. Well, tell Joyce that we do remember you guys, and I hope we'll see you again.
All right.
At a future SPS meeting.
Yeah, I hope to be there this coming year in California. So that'll be fun. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and God bless, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Hey, thanks for listening today. If you'd like to purchase any of Dr. Goff's books, be sure to check the links in the description below. And if you'd like to share something that was particularly helpful from what was shared in this episode, be sure to go check out the video on YouTube, and be sure to post a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And if you found this helpful, be sure to like it and share it with others, maybe family or friends that you think might find this helpful. And be sure to follow follow Theology Breakdown on your favorite social media platform. Thanks for listening. And hey, it's my privilege to support you in your journey in following Christ. Thanks so much, and God bless. Much love.